One American destroyer charged a fleet with 4 battleships. At dawn on the 25th of October 1944, east of Samar in the central Philippines, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force was already moving south after coming through San Bernardino Strait. His force included the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, and it had surprised the American escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3 during the Battle off Samar, part of Leyte Gulf. On the other side of that horizon was Commander Ernest Edwin Evans of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer 376 feet 5 inches long. Evans had already told his crew, as recalled in the documented ship story and repeated in his Medal of Honor citation record, that this was going to be a fighting ship and he intended to go in harm's way. What Kurita did not know was that one of the smallest American ships present was about to turn toward his battle line instead of away from it. Within about 3 hours, Kurita's force would break off action and turn away from the escort carriers it had surprised. The question at Samar was how one destroyer could help force that result at all. The American force off Samar was Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague. It had 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. USS Johnston, hull number DD-557, was one of the 3 destroyers. The Japanese force approaching from the north was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. At Samar it brought 4 battleships, including Yamato and Nagato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Yamato alone displaced about 72,800 tons at full load and carried 9 18.1-inch guns. Johnston displaced about 2,100 tons standard, could make 35 knots, carried 5 5-inch, 38 caliber guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, and smoke generators for screening. Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. had taken the U.S. Third Fleet north after Japanese carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Kurita, after losing Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th of October, still expected to break into Leyte Gulf and strike the invasion shipping. Sprague's escort carriers expected to support troops ashore. They were not organized to fight a surface action against battleships and heavy cruisers. That gap defined the stakes at dawn. Johnston had been built for fleet screening and torpedo attack, not for standing in front of battleships. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer with thin plating, no armor protection against heavy shells, and a crew trained to fight fast, use smoke, and strike at range with torpedoes. Her captain mattered. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was a Cherokee officer from Oklahoma, and before Johnston went into combat he had told his crew that anyone who did not want to go where the action was could transfer off. The point was clear. He meant aggressive action under fire. By late October 1944, the larger operation had already set the conditions. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines had brought the U.S. 7th Fleet into Leyte Gulf. Japanese planners answered with Operation Shogo 1. Kurita's center force came through the Sibuyan Sea, was hit repeatedly by carrier aircraft on the 24th of October, then reversed course and later passed through San Bernardino Strait during the night. That movement mattered because it put heavy surface ships on the unprotected flank of Taffy 3 at first light. The American escort carriers east of Samar were launching and recovering aircraft for close support. Their aircraft were armed mainly for ground attack or anti-submarine patrol, not for stopping battleships. Their maximum speed was far below that of Kurita's fastest ships. The destroyers were the only American ships present with torpedoes, smoke, and enough speed to act immediately. If the Japanese gunnery remained organized, the carriers would be hit in sequence. If that timing could be broken, courage bought them time. At dawn contact, Johnston was in position to move out, make smoke, and attack. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans acted at once. At about 0700, as lookouts and radar reports confirmed heavy ships to the north, USS Johnston turned out from the carriers and began laying smoke. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague ordered his escort carriers to make rain squalls and launch what aircraft they could. Evans took Johnston toward the gun flashes. The first need was to spoil Japanese fire control. Johnston accelerated to flank speed, about 34 to 35 knots, and used her smoke generators to hide parts of Taffy 3 while she moved into attack position. Against her were ships whose main batteries outranged everything she carried. Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships opened fire as the range fell. Near misses threw up columns of water around the destroyer. Evans kept closing. Johnston's 5.5-inch, 38 guns began firing on the leading cruisers. The shells could not stop a battleship, but they could rake bridge areas, start fires, damage topside equipment, and force enemy ships to watch the small attacker instead of the carriers beyond her. Evans was trying to break Kurita's timing. A destroyer moving fast across the line of advance, making smoke and firing, created a problem Japanese officers had to answer immediately. He then committed the ship's main striking weapon. Johnston came into torpedo range and fired a full spread from one quintuple mount. 10 21-inch tubes carried in 2 mounts, 5 in that attack. American accounts and Japanese damage records agree on the result that mattered. The heavy cruiser Kamana was hit forward. The blast blew off her bow. Kamana dropped out of formation badly damaged. Other Japanese ships altered course as the torpedo threat became real. That reaction was the point. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's force had expected to overrun escort carriers, not to face an immediate destroyer torpedo attack from inside the American screen. Every turn to avoid torpedoes changed bearing, range, and spotting. Every ship that maneuvered complicated the fire of the ships behind it. Evans had gone out not to die in place, but to interrupt a battleship force at the exact moment it was trying to settle into gunnery. From that point, the Japanese approach was no longer a straight run on the carriers. The attack worked because Johnston used the few advantages a Fletcher-class destroyer actually had. She was small, fast, and hard to range cleanly when making smoke and changing course. Her 5.5-inch, 38 caliber guns fired a 55-pound projectile and, in a surface fight, could shoot rapidly enough to harass directors, signal positions, and exposed crews. Her torpedoes mattered more. The Mark 15 was a 21-inch weapon with the reach to force heavy ships to turn even before a hit was confirmed. At Samar, that threat had tactical value beyond damage. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans did not need to sink multiple capital ships. He needed minutes. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague's escort carriers could make about 17 to 19 knots. Kurita's battleships and cruisers were faster and carried guns from 8-inch cruiser batteries up to Yamato's 18.1-inch main battery. If Japanese columns maintained course and concentrated fire, Taffy 3's carriers would be bracketed in sequence. A destroyer charge changed that geometry. Smoke reduced observation. High speed made range estimates unstable. Torpedoes imposed an immediate decision on every enemy captain who saw or suspected tracks. From the Japanese side, the first expectation had been favorable. Kurita had broken through San Bernardino Strait and had surprised a force of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. What his officers encountered instead was aggressive resistance at very short notice. Japanese accounts after the battle show confusion about the strength and composition of the American force. That confusion did not come from one torpedo hit alone. It came from several American actions beginning at once, and Johnston's move was among the first and most direct. Evans understood the technical truth of destroyer warfare. Against heavier ships, survival depended on forcing them to react before they could aim methodically. The immediate result was measurable. Heavy cruiser Kamana was put out of the van after losing her bow. The Japanese line began to maneuver under torpedo threat. That bought time for Taffy 3's escort carriers to keep turning away, increase smoke, and launch more aircraft, many armed with whatever was already on board. In the opening phase, minutes were the critical commodity, and Johnston helped create them. Johnston also drew fire onto herself. Japanese shells soon found the range. Survivor accounts and official summaries agree that Evans' ship was hit early and hard after the torpedo run, though detailed hit counts vary by source. What does not vary is the effect. The destroyer had announced that the American screen would attack, not scatter. On the Japanese side, that mattered at once. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita later wrote in his report and post-war accounts that he believed he was engaging stronger forces than he had first assumed. Historians are careful with that point, because the confusion came from the whole battle picture, not from Johnston alone, but Johnston was part of the evidence Kurita was receiving in real time. There is also a documented human detail from the ship itself. During the action, Evans fought from the open bridge, exposing himself to splinters and spray so he could keep control of the ship's turns and speed as she attacked and screened. That was consistent with the way survivors remembered his command style. In the hours that followed, Kurita's center force would continue to press south and Taffy 3's destroyers, destroyer escorts, escort carriers, and aircraft would keep attacking. The first exchange off Samar had already established the new fact of the battle. Kurita's force had surprise and superior gunpowder, but it did not have an uncontested approach, and Johnston was still in the fight as the damage began to show. Johnston did not come out of that first torpedo run as a clean attacker ready to strike again. She came out damaged almost at once. Japanese shellfire cut into her engineering spaces, and after boiler and engine casualties her speed dropped sharply, with survivor accounts placing her down near 17 knots. Steering control was also affected, forcing control measures from aft and through emergency methods as the ship kept turning back toward the fight instead of away from it. That loss of speed made the next phase more dangerous than the opening charge. A Fletcher-class destroyer could live on speed and smoke. Johnston now had less of both, yet her gun crews kept firing through smoke they had laid themselves and through shell splashes that repeatedly hid the targets. Survivors recalled periods when whole enemy ships vanished behind water columns and gray smoke, then reappeared just long enough for another rapid salvo from the 5-inch mounts. The ship also kept changing the picture for the Japanese. Several accounts from the American side describe Johnston seeming to reappear after enemy fire had already hammered her. That mattered because Japanese commanders were trying to sort targets in rain squalls, smoke screens, and evasive maneuvers while under repeated torpedo alarms from multiple American ships. A destroyer that should have been finished was still crossing the line of fire, still shooting, still making itself count. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was wounded during this stage. Survivor testimony agrees that he was hit by shell fragments, and accounts remembered him continuing to command despite those wounds. The detail survivors kept returning to was physical exposure. He was still where splinters and blast could reach him, still directing turns and gunfire while the ship shook under near misses and direct hits. Another overlooked detail is how small caliber fire still had tactical value after the torpedoes were gone. Johnston's 5-inch guns were not trying to penetrate armor belts. They were striking superstructures, directors, and bridge areas. Even when damage was limited, every salvo forced attention upward and outward. The smaller ship looked more dangerous than it had any right to be because she was still acting like an attacker after losing the conditions that made attack possible. That contradiction became one of the central facts of Samar. A damaged destroyer could still alter decisions inside a much larger fleet. The larger meaning of Samar does not rest on Johnston alone, but Johnston helps explain it clearly. Kurita brought a powerful surface force through San Bernardino Strait and achieved surprise. By normal paper calculation, escort carriers and their screen should have been overwhelmed. Instead, Taffy 3 turned the battle into a running emergency that never let the Japanese settle into methodical destruction. The destroyers and destroyer escorts attacked with torpedoes and smoke. The escort carriers kept launching aircraft, often with whatever ordnance was already loaded and sometimes with little more than machine gun fire to offer. Those aircraft returned again and again. American official histories and post-war Japanese accounts agree on the broad result. Kurita faced constant interference, incomplete information, and repeated signs of resistance stronger than the actual American order of battle. That is where the phrase "courage bought them time" becomes a factual statement, not a slogan. Time allowed the carriers to open range. Time allowed more aircraft to get airborne. Time allowed smoke screens to thicken, bearings to shift, and Japanese formations to separate under torpedo threat. In this action, minutes had operational value. Japanese fear is visible in their reactions. Heavy cruisers and battleships maneuvered against torpedoes. Formation coherence suffered. Gunnery opportunities came and went. Kurita later reported that he believed he had encountered carrier forces supported by cruisers and destroyers in greater strength than was actually present. Historians are careful here. They do not reduce his withdrawal to one mistake or one ship. They point instead to cumulative friction. Air attack, aggressive destroyer assaults, rain squalls, smoke, ship losses, and uncertainty about American reinforcements. Samuel Eliot Morison, in the U.S. Naval History, treated Samar as an action in which audacity at the tactical level produced strategic effect out of proportion to tonnage. The U.S. Navy's own battle accounts make the same point more dryly. Taffy 3 denied Kurita a clean finish. That was the proof Samar offered about American war power in late 1944. Not simply industrial output, but a system in which escort carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, and improvised air attacks could break the confidence of a superior surface fleet. And that returns the battle to the men who stayed with Johnston as her chances narrowed. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans remains the central figure because his decision pattern never changed after the ship was hit. He had promised before combat that Johnston would be a fighting ship. At Samar he acted on that promise, led the first charge, was wounded by shell fragments during the battle, and continued commanding from exposed positions. When Johnston was lost later that morning, Evans was not seen again. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. One of the clearest surviving officer accounts came from Lieutenant Robert C. Hagan, Johnston's gunnery officer. He described Evans as cool and aggressive under fire and recorded that the ship continued fighting after severe damage had already reduced her mobility and power. Hagan survived the sinking. His testimony helps anchor the picture of a ship still shooting back while increasingly disabled. The gun crews are visible in those accounts not as a blur, but as men serving mounts until the mounts were knocked out. Survivors described loading and firing through smoke, shock, and failing communications. They also described damage control parties trying to keep power, fight fires, and hold the ship together long after the odds had turned beyond recovery. That work did not have the drama of the torpedo run, but it is why Johnston remained a factor in the battle after her first attack. The end came only after repeated punishment. Johnston was left dead in the water and the order to abandon ship was given. Men went over the side into the sea under enemy fire and with the battle still moving around them. The documented human detail that survivors remembered was simple and hard to forget. Oil in the water, men clinging to Kapok life jackets, and the ship that had kept reappearing now finally settling out from under them. Johnston sank on the 25th of October 1944. Of her crew, 186 were lost and 141 survived. Evans is the named fate most closely bound to the ship, because he disappeared with her. The rest are best honored in the total that tells the scale of the loss and the scale of the resistance, as the battle's consequences continued to unfold beyond the place where Johnston went down. As Johnston settled and the survivors drifted in the water, the battle was still moving south. The effect of those early attacks continued almost immediately. USS Hull, USS Heermann, and the destroyer escorts joined the torpedo attacks. The escort carriers kept turning away and launching aircraft in waves. Many of those planes had armor-piercing or depth charges loaded for other missions. Others made dry runs and strafing attacks simply to keep pressure on Japanese decks and bridges. By late morning, Kurita's force had been pulled apart into separated groups chasing targets through smoke and squalls instead of driving in one ordered line toward Leyte Gulf. That mattered in the next hours and days. At 0920 on the 25th of October 1944, Kurita ordered a general withdrawal. The surviving escort carriers of Taffy 3 had not destroyed his force, but they had denied him the quick surface victory his mission required. He turned north, regrouped, and passed back through San Bernardino Strait. That same day, the larger Japanese operation continued to unravel elsewhere in Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy carriers had drawn Admiral William F. Halsey Jr. north, but off Cape Engano 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. In Surigao Strait, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force had already been shattered in the night action. The result was not abstract. Kurita's withdrawal left the invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf unhit by his battleships and heavy cruisers. Japan had committed major surface units in a coordinated attempt to break the American lodgment in the Philippines. After the 25th of October, that chance was gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy still had large ships afloat, including Yamato, but it no longer mounted another major surface thrust of that kind against the Leyte landings. The attrition also kept mounting. Heavy cruiser Chokai was lost that day. Chikuma was sunk. Suzuya was lost after air attack and secondary explosions. Kamana survived Samar but had to retire and was later sunk on the 25th of November 1944 in the Philippines. The tactical confusion Johnston helped create had become operational failure for Kurita's mission. By the time the battle reports were written, the question was no longer whether Taffy 3 had been surprised. It was how a surprised force had forced the attacker to abandon the objective. Samar is treated as a turning point because it exposed the limit of Japanese surface power in late 1944. Before dawn on the 25th of October, Kurita still possessed battleships, heavy cruisers, surprise, and a route toward vulnerable shipping. By noon, he had broken contact with much weaker American forces. That before and after contrast is why standard naval histories keep returning to the action. Samuel Eliot Morison called the battle off Samar one of the most remarkable actions in naval history. The judgment rests on documented effects. A force built around escort carriers and screenships prevented a powerful battle fleet from completing its mission. The U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command makes the same link in plainer terms. The destroyer and aircraft attacks, combined with smoke and aggressive maneuver, convinced Kurita he was facing stronger opposition and helped force his withdrawal. The enemy side eventually said so in its own way. In post-war accounts, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stated that he believed he had run into more substantial American forces than the small escort carriers actually present. Captain Tamechi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Yukikaze and later wrote of the battle in Japanese Destroyer Captain, described the American defense as ferocious and emphasized the confusion caused by continuous attacks. That is the conversion point in the record. What began as a favorable interception became, for Japanese officers inside it, an engagement shaped by caution, uncertainty, and the need to respect torpedoes from ships they should have overrun. Johnston's charge fits that assessment exactly. One destroyer could not defeat 4 battleships by weight of fire. It could make admirals, cruiser captains, and destroyer commanders react to torpedo danger, smoke, and the possibility of more American ships beyond the weather. At Samar, that reaction was enough. Kurita lost freedom of action at the moment he needed it most. That is why the event endures beyond tactical drama. It helped protect the Leyte landing force at a critical hour, and it left behind named dead, survivors, citations, and places where the battle is still held in public memory. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions at Samar. His citation recorded that he boldly intercepted the Japanese fleet and fought with valiant distinction against overwhelming odds. He was 36 years old when Johnston was lost on the 25th of October 1944. His body was never recovered. Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague survived the war and died in 1955. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagan, Johnston's gunnery officer, survived the sinking and later helped preserve the ship's story through his recollections. The ship's own afterlife took much longer to come into view. In 2019, the research vessel Petrel located the wreck of USS Johnston in the Philippine Sea. In 2021, a deeper survey identified the wreck in greater detail at about 6,469 meters, making it the deepest known shipwreck identified at that time. The bow, the hull number, and the twisted remains of a destroyer that had gone straight at a battle line were no longer just survivor memory. Johnston and Taffy 3 are also marked in the institutions that carry the Navy's memory. The National Museum of the U.S. Navy and the National World War II Museum interpret the battle off Samar as part of Leyte Gulf. Evans is commemorated in naval history displays and in the official Medal of Honor record. In Oklahoma, his home state, his name remains especially prominent. The destroyer escort USS Evans, commissioned in 1945, carried that memory into the post-war fleet. There is a smaller human detail that stays with the story. Survivors remembered K-pop life jackets dark with fuel oil after the sinking. Decades later, the wreck gave that memory a fixed place on the seafloor. So the opening image holds. One American destroyer did charge a fleet with 4 battleships. It was not a gesture. It was a tactical attack made to force a stronger fleet to maneuver, hesitate, and lose time. Off Samar, that is what happened. Johnston was sunk. Ernest E. Evans was lost. Kurita turned away. Courage bought them time. If stories like this matter to you, the next one goes even deeper.